The rancher lived quiet, his days marked only by cattle and dust until he noticed his maid hiding a limp she thought no one could see. When he pressed gently, her eyes dropped, her silence louder than any confession. By dawn, whispers spread through town, and the sheriff's office would never look the same. What began as a single step staggered and painful was about to unravel secrets buried in blood, power, and betrayal. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. The rancher had risen early, the way he always did, the pale light of morning slanting across the dust of his yard as he leaned on the fence rail and watched his cattle shuffle and snort in the still air. But his attention was pulled inward toward the house when he saw her, his maid, quiet as always, carrying a bucket of water from the well, the weight sloshing with each careful step, her skirt brushing the dirt as she moved with a rhythm that didn't sit right. And then he saw it. The stumble. The catch of her foot as though her body no longer trusted itself. The sharp hitch in her gait that spoke not of clumsiness but of pain. He moved before he even thought, boots grinding against the earth, calling out her name, his voice softer than he expected. And when she looked up, the morning sun caught her eyes, wide and startled, like a doe cornered at the edge of the woods. And for a heartbeat he almost stopped, not wanting to crowd her, but the limp pulled at him, demanded he step closer. He reached out, his hand brushing her arm, and in that instant she flinched so violently the bucket nearly fell from her grip, water splashing over the rim, her shoulders tightening as though expecting a blow, and the rancher's breath caught because that reaction was not born of a simple stumble, not born of chores too heavy or a day too long. It was fear, raw and unguarded, that flashed across her face before she lowered her gaze, letting her hair veil the truth she would not speak. His chest tightened, anger and confusion fighting for air inside him, because he knew the men and women of this land bore their share of injuries. Cattle could kick, tools could break, the dust could steal breath from lungs, but this was not the limp of an honest accident. This was something darker, something left by a hand or a boot or worse. Something that had carved into her body and left her too frightened to name it. He wanted to press, to demand answers, to lift her chin and make her look at him and say the words. But he also knew the weight of silence, the way it could chain a person tighter than rope, and the way her fingers clutched that bucket as though it were the only thing tethering her to the moment told him that if he pushed too hard now, she would retreat into shadows he could never reach. Still, the seed of suspicion had taken root, cold and stubborn, and as he watched her retreat toward the house, her limp stark against the morning light, he felt a storm begin to stir in his gut, because something had marked her, and though she thought she could hide it behind lowered eyes and hurried steps, he had seen it, and he could not unsee it. The rancher stood there, fists tightening at his sides, and the cattle lowed behind him, restless as if they too felt the tension in the air. And he understood then that whatever wound she carried was not hers alone to bear anymore, because he had witnessed it, and in a town where whispers spread faster than wildfire, he knew it was only a matter of time before her silence became everyone's question and his burden to answer. The lanterns of the saloon flickered low, smoke curling thick in the rafters as laughter and fiddle music tangled with the clink of glasses. Yet the moment the rancher pushed through the bat-wing doors, the rhythm broke like a rope snapped in two, voices faltering into mutters, dice frozen mid-roll. And though no one outright turned their back, the shift was sharp enough that he felt the change in his bones, the same way a horse senses a storm before the first strike of lightning. He stepped in slow, dust still clinging to his boots, the scent of hay and sweat trailing him, and as he made his way toward the counter, his eyes swept the room, catching how conversations bent inward, words hushed beneath the hum of the fiddle that tried too hard to reclaim the air, and it was then he felt it, the sheriff's gaze, colder than the bottle of whiskey sweating on the table before him, fixed square on him from across the haze of smoke. Unwavering, sharp, like the barrel of a rifle leveled without a sound. The rancher met it for as long as he could bear, his jaw tightening, but there was something in that look, a challenge unspoken, as though the sheriff were daring him to speak the question that weighed like lead in his chest, daring him to demand answers about limps that weren't from falls and fear that had no rightful place in his maid's eyes. And though no words passed between them, the room itself seemed to lean in on their silence, the tension thick enough that even the bartender's hands trembled a little as he poured. The rancher took his glass but did not drink, his eyes sweeping again, catching the way a pair of men in the corner stopped their whispering when he glanced their way, the way the piano player's tune faltered for half a beat before he forced his fingers steady again, and all of it told him what his gut already knew: something was being concealed, held tight in this town like a secret bound in barbed wire, and everyone knew their part in keeping it. He thought of the maid, of the way she had flinched when his hand brushed her arm, and he felt the stirrings of rage mixed with helplessness, for now he saw that her silence was not hers alone but woven into the very fabric of this place, guarded by men with badges and stares that cut like knives. The sheriff didn't blink, didn't flinch, just sat there with the brim of his hat shadowing his eyes, and the rancher felt that look burrow into him deeper than any word could, warning him off, daring him closer all at once, and though his fingers twitched toward the whiskey, he let it sit, his throat too dry for drink, for he understood now that the limp, the flinch, the whispers that trailed behind him like shadows, all of it, led back to this gaze, this figure who sat like a king in his court of silence, and the rancher realized that if he pressed further, he would not only stir a truth buried deep, but also rouse an enemy whose reach stretched farther than law should ever go. The night was long and brittle with silence when he returned to the ranch, the saloon smoke and stares clinging to him like a second skin, and though the cattle had bedded down and the wind whispered low across the dry grass, there was no peace waiting in his walls, for he found her in the kitchen, bent over the stove though no fire burned, her hands twisting the hem of her apron like it was the only thing keeping her upright. He didn't mean to startle her, but when he stepped into the room her shoulders stiffened, and he saw the shadow of pain cross her face as she shifted her weight, her limp more pronounced in the lantern's glow than it had been in the morning light. He spoke her name softly, a word meant to soothe, and she turned just enough that he could see her eyes, wet at the corners though no tears fell, and with a voice broken into fragments like glass scattered across a floor she whispered that it hadn't been a fall, that no misstep or accident had carved the wound into her body, that it had been done to her, a beating that left more than bruises, one that marked her bones and forced her steps to carry pain with every motion. She didn't name him, didn't have to, for the silence that followed her words was louder than any name could be, and in that silence the rancher heard what she could not speak, heard the echo of boots on wood floors and the iron weight of authority turned cruel, heard the sheriff's gaze pinning him in the saloon and felt the truth settle like ash in his chest. This was no random cruelty, no nameless man's temper, but the hand of the law itself, the shadow that sat in judgment of everyone in town. His fists clenched at his sides until his knuckles whitened, and he fought the urge to curse, to demand she speak it plain. But the tremor in her voice and the way her eyes darted toward the window, as if even the walls might betray her, stopped him cold, for he saw that her silence was not cowardice but survival, and to force her words would be to strip her of the only shield she still held. He took a step closer, the floor groaning under his weight, and though she flinched at the sound, she did not pull away when he laid his hand gently on the table between them, close enough that she could take it if she wished. The lantern light flickered, throwing long shadows across the room, and in those shadows he saw not just her suffering but the web of fear that bound the town, a web spun by a man who wore a badge but hid a wolf's hunger beneath it. Her lips parted as though she wanted to say more, to release the name that burned in her silence, but instead she only shook her head, her hair falling forward like a curtain, and in that gesture he felt her plea: don't ask, don't make me say it, because saying it would make it real, and real would make it deadly. The rancher's chest burned with fury, but he swallowed it down, because this wasn't the moment for rage, not when the truth had been offered in trembling shards, and he knew then that he carried her secret now, carried it as surely as he carried the land's dust in his boots, and though she had not named her tormentor, the rancher understood that sometimes silence spoke louder than words, and the name she did not speak would be the very one that shadowed his every step in town. The rancher lay awake long after the lanterns had burned low, the rafters of his house creaking like old bones above him, every sound in the night louder than it ought to be, the restless shifting of the cattle in the corral, the dry rasp of wind against the eaves, the faint hitch in the maid's step as she moved quietly about her duties, thinking herself unheard, and all of it pressed on him like a vice, squeezing his chest until he could hardly breathe. He had lived most of his life by silence, keeping his head down, letting the world pass him by with only cattle and dust as his companions, and it had kept him safe, even in a town where men measured one another with narrow eyes and harsher tongues. But now that silence turned traitor, gnawing at him from the inside because he knew what it meant to keep his mouth shut. Knew it meant leaving her to bear the limp and the fear, to suffer under the same hand that ruled over every lawman's star and every whispered secret in town. And yet the other side of the scale was no lighter, for to speak her truth aloud was to draw the sheriff's gaze in full, to put a target on his own back, his ranch, his cattle, the fragile scrap of livelihood he had built with blood and grit. And the sheriff was not a man who forgave challenges, not a man who let whispers turn to words without crushing them back into silence. The rancher's mind ran in circles, each thought snapping like barbed wire. Because he could see the path of both choices too clearly. If he spoke, he could lose everything. His land seized on some trumped-up claim. His body left in an alley under the weight of an accident. His maid perhaps driven from town or worse, punished for daring to be the cause of his defiance. If he stayed silent, he would keep his cattle, his roof, his skin, but each day he would see her limp, see her eyes drop when his hand moved too quickly, see her fear harden into the kind of hollow that rotted a soul from within, and the knowledge that he had chosen his own comfort over her dignity would hollow him right alongside her. He rose before dawn, unable to lie still, pacing the length of the barn as the sky bled from black into gray, his boots striking a rhythm that matched the pounding of his thoughts. And he realized with a cold twist in his gut that silence, once his shield, had become a weight he could not bear much longer, heavier than the cattle he wrangled, heavier than the grave he had dug for his wife. And every time he saw the sheriff's shadow lurking in the back of his mind, he felt the choice tightening around him like a noose. By the time the first light spilled across the prairie, his shoulders sagged beneath the truth he could not escape. Whether he spoke or stayed silent, something would be broken. His land, his life, or the fragile courage of the woman who worked under his roof. And the longer he waited, the heavier the silence grew, until he knew it would crush him if he did not act. The rancher had been sitting at the edge of his bed, boots still on, hands clasped tight enough to whiten his knuckles, when the glow of firelight licked across the walls of his room, the shadows stretching tall and restless, as though the night itself had come alive. And he rose in a cold sweat, pushing open the door to find two torches cutting through the dark like eyes that did not blink. The deputies sat astride their horses with the easy arrogance of men who carried a sheriff's power in their holsters. Their hats pulled low, but their smirks plain even in the uncertain light. And when they spoke, their words dripped like syrup gone sour, false courtesy coating the steel of the threat beneath. "Evenin', rancher. Long night for thinkin', ain't it? Best you mind your own." The phrase was dressed like neighborly advice, but it landed like a hammer against his chest, and though the torches crackled and spat, it was their eyes that burned hotter, waiting for him to show fear, to stammer some acknowledgement that he'd heard the message clear. His throat tightened, every instinct telling him to spit back, to challenge them, to ask just what business of his own they thought he'd forgotten. But the weight of the maid's silence pressed against his ribs, warning him that the wrong word now could set the whole ranch ablaze figuratively or perhaps even literally, if these men chose to ride back with kerosene and no conscience. The cattle lowed nervously in the corral, their unease carrying on the wind, and the rancher realized the whole place felt like tinder waiting for a spark, the deputies the match in waiting, and he swallowed his anger down like broken glass, nodding once as though he hadn't caught the venom in their tone, though inside his blood boiled with the insult of it, with the gall of men who thought they could threaten him beneath his own roof and leave without consequence. They lingered a moment longer, letting the silence stretch until it was taut as a hangman's rope, their horses stamping and snorting in the dirt, before one leaned down just enough to let his torchlight catch the iron star pinned to his vest, the metal gleaming like a brand of ownership, as if to remind the rancher whose law ruled this town and whose wrath would follow should he forget it. Then, without another word, they wheeled their mounts and rode back into the darkness, the glow of their torches shrinking into embers and then vanishing altogether, leaving the rancher standing in the cold breath of midnight with his fists clenched and his heart hammering, the echo of their warning ringing louder than the night itself. "Mind your own, or watch everything you love burn." And as he turned back toward the quiet house, his eyes drawn to the faint outline of the maid's shadow in the upstairs window, he knew that silence was no longer a shield but a shackle, and every second he wore it only tightened the sheriff's grip on them both. The morning broke uneasy, the light pale and thin as though even the sun hesitated to rise over the weight of the night before. And when the rancher came in from checking the cattle, he found her waiting in the kitchen, her apron wrung in her trembling hands, her face drawn tight with sleeplessness and fear. She didn't look at him at first, only at the worn boards of the floor. Her lips pressed so firmly together it seemed the words might tear her apart on the way out. But when they finally came, they fell in fragments, cracked and urgent. She begged him not to stand against them, not to put himself in the sheriff's path, because men who tried to push back only ended in graves no one dared mark, and she could not watch another life swallowed in blood because of what had been done to her. Her voice was thin, almost breaking, but every word was laced with terror, a kind of learned fear that carried years in its bones, and the rancher's chest burned as he listened, the echo of the deputy's torches still hot in his memory. He wanted to promise her safety, to swear that he could hold off the law's corruption with nothing but grit and a rifle. But he knew too well how far the sheriff's reach stretched, how deep his claws ran through the town, and so he stood silent, his jaw tight, because anything he said would sound like a lie even if it wasn't. Yet when she finally lifted her eyes to his, he saw it, that flicker, small but undeniable, buried beneath the surface of her fear. Hope, fragile as a flame in a windstorm. A desperate plea her lips would not voice, but her gaze could not hide. That maybe, just maybe, someone might fight for her when she no longer had the strength to fight for herself. It struck him like a knife, because she begged him to turn away with her mouth, but her eyes begged him to stay, to stand, to do what no one else in this town had dared. The contradiction clawed at him, left him torn between honoring her spoken words or answering the truth that trembled behind them. And in that moment he realized that silence was not only her prison but his own. If he heeded her plea, he would keep her alive in body but broken in spirit, leaving her shackled forever beneath the sheriff's shadow. If he defied it, he risked blood, his own and maybe hers, but also gave that flicker of hope a chance to burn brighter. His throat ached with the weight of it, the burden heavier than any ranch work he had ever known, and as she turned away, retreating back into the quiet corners of the house, he knew that whatever choice he made, it would not be just his life balanced on the edge of it, but hers, her dignity, and perhaps the very soul of a town too long held in the grip of silence. The barn smelled of hay and sweat and the faint musk of cattle, but to the rancher it carried ghosts heavier than any scent. For as he paced the dim aisles between the stalls, the night's warning still gnawing at his bones, memories he had spent years burying rose like a flood he could no longer hold back. The image of his brother, young and reckless, but with a heart too stubborn to bend, dragged from their father's porch by men wearing the same badges that now gleamed on the sheriff's chest, his voice hoarse from shouting innocence into ears that never listened, his face bloodied under fists that carried the law's authority, and the crack of a gun in the dust that silenced him forever. The rancher had been younger then, but old enough to remember the stillness that followed, the way his mother's wails carried across the valley, the way the town whispered "fool boy" instead of murder, as though the weight of a star-shaped badge erased the sin of killing. And ever since, he had vowed never to take up the rifle, never to walk the same path of vengeance, because he had seen where it led to grief, to ruin, to graves dug shallow on lonely hillsides. But now, standing alone beneath the barn's sagging beams, the maid's limp burned in his mind, her flinch when he reached for her arm, the deputy's torches searing into his memory, and he felt the old wound reopened, raw and bleeding, until his hands itched with the same fire he had sworn to smother. His gaze fell to the rifle mounted high on the wall, untouched for years, its wood polished by time and memory more than use, and he stared at it until the air thickened, until his pulse hammered like hooves across the prairie. He told himself he only needed to feel it, to remember his weight. But when his hands finally closed around the stock, rough and steady, he knew he was lying, knew that by touching it again he had already crossed a line inside himself, because the rifle was not a tool for defense anymore. It was a promise, a vow etched into steel, one that said he could no longer keep silent, no longer hide behind cattle and dust while the sheriff's shadow spread over everything he cared for. His brother's face flickered in his mind's eye, but this time it was not only grief that filled him, it was fury. The raw, gnawing fury that justice had never been served, and that silence had only fed the wolf. His knuckles tightened on the wood, his breath shallow but steady, and though he whispered into the emptiness that he was no killer, that he didn't want blood, the barn gave no answer, only the creak of beams and the restless snorts of cattle, and in that silence he felt the truth swell heavy in his chest. The choice had become unbearable, and whether he wanted it or not, the rifle in his hands meant he had already chosen one way or another. He would not let the past repeat itself, not with her, not with the sheriff, not while he still drew breath. She slipped the ledger into his palm like a contraband heart. Small and ragged with a cloth binding that had been mended so many times its stitches were a map of patience and danger. And when he opened it, the pages smelled faintly of tobacco and soap and the dust of rooms where whispers went to die. The ink was cramped and furious in places. A ledger of sins rather than accounts, dates penciled in the sheriff's neat hand, amounts tucked beside names that made the rancher's stomach drop, payments for turning a blind eye to gambling dens, smaller sums for letting cattle rustlers pass, heavier sums for silence bought after fights left men broken in alleys, each entry a stitch in a web that reached farther than he had dared imagine. And alongside the numbers, initials and clipped notes. 2 deputies cleared. Barn fire insurance claim handled. Mrs. Harrow's boy quieted. That sounded less like bookkeeping and more like a map of corruption spread through the town's veins. The maid watched him with eyes that had grown both desperate and fierce, the tremor in her hands steadier than her voice as she tugged the apron strings tighter and pointed to a line where the sheriff had noted a payment the week after the deputy's midnight visit to the ranch, a small, neat sum, with a monosyllabic remark that implied threats delivered and favors claimed. And as the rancher's thumb smudged the ink, a slow, cold realization bled into him. This was not a ledger kept for bookkeeping, but a ledger kept as insurance, a ledger to be produced when favors needed recall or when men needed reminding of whose side their loyalty bought. His mind raced, cataloging faces from the saloon, from church, from the quiet porches where neighbors pretended to sleep with their consciences if not their eyes, names that tied the sheriff's hand to merchants, to the preacher who had preached obedience, to the banker who had quietly foreclosed farms, and the ledger made each connection obscene and undeniable. Fear coiled under his ribs, not just for himself now, but for the maid who had risked everything to hide this book, for the cattle that could be set loose in the night to stampede through fence lines, for the little homestead that could be declared tax delinquent by a crooked clerk with a wink. And yet beneath that fear there came a sharper flame. Proof, clean and ugly. Proof that could topple a man who had legs of stone only because everyone had fed him lies and silence. She had found the ledger lodged behind a loose board in the sheriff's office, she whispered, her voice a thread pulled tight, confessing how she'd watched him count the plates of coins and mark the names with a touch that was almost ritual, how she'd copied entries while sweeping, how she'd traded her lunches for nights awake transcribing ink into her own trembling book, and when she spoke of the risk she'd taken, of the nights she'd hidden beneath a wagon to listen for the sheriff's heavy boots, the rancher felt both admiration and shame for not having seen it sooner. Together, fingers stained with ledger dust, they traced lines that mattered most, payments that coincided with beatings, with farms burned for debts unpaid, with the sudden accidents that had silenced troublesome voices, and the pattern was clear enough that even a town drunk's memory could stitch the story into sense. Danger loomed like a hawk over a field mouse. He thought if the sheriff learned she'd taken the ledger, they would not bother with trials or talk. They would come with ropes and excuses and make examples of both of them. But without it, the ledger was a tinderless truth, impotent and useless, and the decision tightened in him like a noose or a vow. Hide the book and risk the town's slow death, or wield it and risk the immediate wrath of a man who already wore the law as armor. She leaned closer, voice dropping until it was a blade between them, saying she did not want him to play hero, that all she wanted was safety, and for the ledger to vanish somewhere far from the sheriff's reach, but the look in her eyes, equal parts pleading and a hunger for justice, said otherwise, and as he closed the book and felt its weight like a promise or a sentence, he understood that this ledger would not just expose a sheriff, it would expose every hand that had fed at his table, and to open it in the light would either set the town free or set it ablaze. The warning reached him not through words spoken plain but through the shudder of the town itself, as though every board and window and dusty street had caught the sheriff's whisper and carried it forward like the breath before a storm. It came first in the way men stood at corners, hats pulled low, their conversations cutting off sharp when his boots echoed down Main Street, the air thick with a silence that meant everyone knew something they would not say, and then in the shift of women herding their children across the road to the other side when he passed, their eyes sliding away from his like looking too long might bring the noose onto their necks as well. By the time he reached the blacksmith's, even the hammering had gone quiet, and the rancher felt the truth coil around him. The sheriff had decided his accident was due, and the whole town already lived in the shadow of it, waiting for the thud of hooves or the crack of a rifle that would erase him like a name scratched out of the ledger. Inside his chest, his heartbeat raced like a spurred horse, and his hand twitched near the rifle he had sworn never to touch again, now hidden beneath his coat like a secret too heavy to conceal. But it wasn't fear that pressed on him, it was furious, cold and sharp, that a man could wear the badge of law yet wield it as a cudgel to silence anyone who dared stand straight. Still, he felt the tension straining inside him to the point of snapping, because this was no longer just his burden or hers, no longer just whispers behind doors. The whole town had become complicit, their silence a chorus of surrender, their averted eyes saying louder than words that they would not stand with him, not when the sheriff's hand stretched wide enough to crush families, not when survival demanded complicity. But survival, he thought bitterly, was no life at all when it meant living beneath another man's cruelty, and he knew in that instant that something had shifted inside him, that his own silence had reached its breaking point, as brittle as dry bone, and if he let the sheriff's accident come to pass without resistance, he would be no better than the ledger's long list of names who had paid to look away. He clenched his fists as he moved back toward the ranch, the weight of the Maid's hidden ledger burning against his ribs, every page inside it a weapon sharper than any blade. And though the streets parted like water around him, though eyes avoided him as if he carried plague, he felt a grim resolve setting in his chest. Law was no longer law. It was a trap dressed in tin stars and polite threats, and if the town was too afraid to tear it down, then it might fall to him to strike first, to trade the sheriff's coming accident for an explosion of truth loud enough to wake even the most brightened heart. Still, beneath the fury and the steel of resolve, he felt the heavy tremor of fear, not for himself but for her, the maid whose limp told a story no ledger needed to record, and as the sky deepened toward dusk, he understood that the sheriff's trap was already closing, and the only way to survive it was to break it wide open before it snapped shut. The dawn came thin and sharp, the kind of light that strips shadows bare, and the rancher felt every ounce of its weight as he guided his horse into town, the maid riding close beside him, her hands clutching the ledger like it was both salvation and a death sentence bound in cloth. The streets were already lined with eyes that dared not meet his. Townsfolk who had risen early not out of habit but out of dread, their silence pressing like a crowd at a hanging. And when he reached the heart of Main Street, the sight waiting for him struck like a hammer. The sheriff, broad and immovable, standing on the steps of his office with his badge catching the pale sun. His deputies fanned out like vultures, their fingers brushing the grips of their holstered guns in lazy readiness, as if itching for an excuse. The rancher pulled his horse to a halt, dust curling at the hooves, and the maid sat rigid beside him, her limp hidden beneath her skirts but her fear plain in the tremble of her jaw. Yet she held the ledger tighter, defiance flickering in her eyes like a stubborn flame, and in that moment the rancher understood that whatever came next, retreat was gone, the path chosen, the reckoning demanded. The sheriff's smile was thin, practiced, a predator's grin disguised as civility, and his voice carried too loud, meant for the gathering crowd as much as for the rancher himself, words steeped in mock courtesy, telling him that men should know their place, that false accusations could tear a town apart, that some folks didn't understand how order was kept in hard country, and all the while his deputies shifted like wolves, waiting for a signal, a word, a flick of a hand. The rancher felt his heart pound against his ribs, but his hand did not falter when it closed around the ledger, lifting it high so every eye could see the worn binding, and the murmur that rippled through the onlookers was sharp, hungry, like dry grass catching fire, because the town had long suspected but never seen proof. And now here it was, trembling in the maid's small hands, real enough to damn a man in tin and steel. The sheriff's smile cracked then, just at the edges, his gaze narrowing, and for the first time the rancher saw something beyond arrogance flicker their calculation. The weighing of how fast a bullet could silence this before the truth spread too far and time seemed to stretch. Each breath a coin tossed between peace and blood. The rancher's rifle lay across his saddle, his hand steady on it, though he prayed he would not need to fire, prayed that words could strike truer than lead. But he knew the frontier rarely bent without breaking, so he spoke, his voice carrying across the street with a clarity born of desperation and resolve, naming aloud the bribes, the blood, the ledger's damning entries, each word another stone cast against the sheriff's tower of silence. And with every sentence the crowd stiffened, men's jaws tightening, women clutching their children, as if hearing aloud what they had all known in their bones but never dared name. The sheriff's hand hovered near his holster now, the deputy's eyes sharp, and the air was so taut it felt as though a single twitch would shatter it into gunfire. But still the rancher spoke, because truth, once unleashed, could not be stuffed back into silence. And in that raw moment, with the sun blazing higher and the town holding its breath, he understood that this reckoning was no longer about one woman's limp or one rancher's rage. It was about who would own justice in the frontier, the star on a crooked chest, or the voice of a man and woman who had dared to break the silence. One truth, one word, one trigger's pull away from deciding the soul of them all.